Hey, welcome to our teaching on the resurrection. I'm excited to talk to you today or tonight, whenever you're watching this, about the reasons why I believe it is reasonable to believe that the resurrection of Jesus was a historical event. Now, wherever you're watching this, do me a favor really quick. If you're watching on Facebook, I would love it if you would click like or share it with your own timeline so that other people can see this. If you're watching on YouTube, you can hit the like button there as well. Or you can make sure you subscribe so that whenever we put out content like this, you make sure you'll know about it. And if you have questions or comments as we go, feel free to put those in the questions and comments, and I'll come back from time to time and check, and maybe I can answer some of those for you if I need to. But here's what I'm going to try to do in this video. Like I said, my goal here is simply to show you why I believe that the resurrection is a reasonable belief. That's my goal. And so we're going to start with part one, just kind of talking about what is the common ground that we can find with almost anybody when we talk about Jesus and the resurrection. And then secondly, we're going to kind of dig into this question of miracles, because that's what the resurrection is. It's a miracle. And so can we really even believe that miracles happen? Do miracles happen? How do we know that miracles happen? And then in part three, we'll kind of get down into the nitty-gritty of what I believe is the best evidence that says that the resurrection is a reasonable belief. So that's what we're going to try to do, and I don't know how long it's going to take, but we'll find out here in just a minute. So let's get started with part one. Part one is, what is the common ground that we can find with just about anybody when we talk about Jesus and the resurrection and all that kind of stuff? Now, why start here? Why start with this idea of common ground? Well, the reason I want to start here is because this is just a good way to have a conversation. In fact, I might suggest that in some of our political debates that we have these days, or even religious debates or doctrinal debates or debates about even, who's got the best football team, a great place to start is to find common ground. Like, what are the things that we can agree on? So before we start disagreeing, let's see what we agree on, because maybe that can shape how we talk about what we disagree about. And so I want to start there, because I think there is some common ground that almost everybody would agree upon, and that can really shape the rest of the conversation for us. But before we get there, let me just point out to you that when you talk about an issue like the resurrection, it's easy to go online and do Google searches and ask questions, and that's great. You should do that. But be aware that there's really two different kind of scholars that you might find. Actually, there's probably three. The third, and we won't talk about this one at all, it's just like atheists, people who don't believe at all and have no desire to believe. But there's two kinds of religious scholars when you talk about the resurrection. The first are what I would call biblical scholars. These are people who they study the Bible and they know all about the Bible. They look at the languages and the manuscripts and the texts and all that. They have a very deep understanding and knowledge of what the Bible says. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are Christian scholars. You see, there's a lot of people who study the Bible who don't believe in the resurrection. And so they study the Bible as just a great piece of literature. It's fantastic writing, but they don't see it as the inspired Word of God. They don't think of it as something that is necessarily authoritative or even reliable or trustworthy. It's just literature for them. And much of that comes from the starting point of not believing in the resurrection. And so because they don't believe in the resurrection, they don't believe that the Bible is actually reliable, because the Bible obviously teaches the resurrection. And we can learn something from these people because they do have a deep knowledge about the Bible. But we ought to remember that at the end of the day, their starting point is not the same as those of us who actually believe in the resurrection. Those of us who actually believe that the Bible is a trustworthy and authoritative and reliable document. And that's what I would call a Christian scholar. Let me show you kind of how this works. Several years ago, there was a group of scholars, and these are what I would call biblical scholars, but not necessarily Christian scholars. They were called the Jesus Seminar. And their stated purpose was to find out what was really the historical Jesus, or who was really the historical Jesus. And essentially, they would sit down and talk about Jesus and what the gospel says, and decide what they thought was probably true and what they thought wasn't. And they would throw out massive parts of the gospel accounts because they didn't think they were reliable accounts. Let me read to you something that kind of summarized their work. This was from a newspaper article about the Jesus Seminar. It said, during the 5 days of meetings that ended last Saturday in Santa Rosa, California, the group concluded, here's their conclusion, that whatever Jesus followers experienced after the crucifixion, it happened in their hearts and minds, not as a matter of history. To read the resurrection accounts literally is to misunderstand the use of the symbolic language that was the hallmark of first century Jewish writers, seminar participants said. In other words, they're saying, look, even Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't believe in an actual physical resurrection. Well, I think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John might have something to say about that, but that's their belief. And this is a quote from one of them. God raised Jesus from the dead is a statement of faith, not fact. That was Stephen J. Patterson, who is an associate professor at a seminary in St. Louis. And the reason I'm pointing this out to you is because I want you to understand where I'm coming from is a very different place than this. I actually believe that the Bible is reliable. I believe that it's inspired by God. I believe that we can trust it in reading what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have to say about Jesus and the resurrection. That's sufficient for me. But I also understand that's not good enough for a lot of people. And so what I want to do in this video is take a little bit of a different approach. Now, I want to talk about why I believe the resurrection is reasonable, why I think it's a perfectly reasonable belief to hold. And I want to do that for the most part without going to the Bible. So in this video, we're not going to talk a lot about what the Gospels say. Now, we will have to a little bit because they're historical documents. But for the most part, we're not going to really look at what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John say about the resurrection because we all know what they say. And we're not really going to look very much at the writings of Paul. Now, we'll sneak a little bit of Paul in at the end because it matters. But for the most part, we won't talk about the writings of Paul. And we're also going to avoid some of the other Gospels that are out there. And you know what I'm talking about. You've probably heard of the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Philip or the Gospel of Mary. These are Gospel accounts that are not included in the Bible, and they're not included for some good reasons. Some of the reasons that they're not included is because they were written hundreds of years after Jesus lived. They were written hundreds of years after the other accounts. They were really never accepted as reliable or historical documents. And in fact, many of them promote doctrine that is completely antithetical to that which Jesus said, that which the church has believed since the very beginning. So those Gospels that you hear about them in books by people like Dan Brown, they're fictional. You can almost view them like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Killer, right? It talks about a historical person and it has some of the historical facts, right? But for the most part, it's just written for fun and it's fiction. And so we're not going to pay any attention to what those say or talk about those at all. What we are going to do is we're going to talk about what people who lived around the time of Jesus had to say about Jesus. We're going to look at the words of historians, some who were contemporaries of Jesus. They actually lived during the same time on earth as Jesus. We'll look at the words of some historians that came within 100 years of Jesus. So that's obviously very close in time to him. We're going to look a little bit at what some of Jesus' adversaries said about him. People who didn't believe that he was God, who didn't really even believe in the resurrection. But we're going to look and see what they had to say about him. Because remember where we're starting is we're looking for common ground. And here's where I think we find the common ground. Almost everybody, in fact, you might say everybody who's reasonable, believes that Jesus was an actual historical person who lived in Palestine, what we think of as modern day Israel, who lived there in the first century and who presumably gathered himself quite a following and eventually died. He was killed. Those are all historical facts, and I want to start here by showing you why we can believe that those are historical facts and why this should be our starting point, and this should really form the common ground for the rest of our conversation. So let's start with a guy named Julius Africanus, who was a writer around the time of Jesus, maybe just a little bit after Jesus, but in some of his historical writing, he actually quotes other historical authors. Now here's the thing, we actually don't have the original manuscripts of some of these other writers, but we have quotes quotes of them. And so we can look at them and say, well, this is what the people who lived at the time of Jesus were saying about him. The first is a fellow named Thallus. And Thallus lived around the same time as Jesus, and he actually wrote about the crucifixion of Jesus. And Julius Africanus quotes Thallus talking about Jesus' crucifixion. This is what he says: "On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus, in the third book of his history," so Julius Africanus gives us a very precise quote. This is from Thallus, and this is in the third book of his history, "calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun." Now, he also mentioned another author named Phlegon, who again lived around the time of Jesus, who also mentioned this same seeming eclipse of the sun that caused darkness on the land at the precise time that Jesus was being crucified. He says, this is again Julius Africanus writing, "Phlegon reports that in the time of Tiberius Caesar, when Jesus was alive and when he was crucified, at full moon there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th to the 9th hour." So again, exactly what we see in the Gospels about Jesus' crucifixion. I'm just starting here because I want you to understand that there are people who did not write the Bible, who did not necessarily even believe in Jesus as the Messiah or as God, but who wrote about him because he was an actual historical figure. And because in their time, he seemed to be significant. Whatever was going on, he seemed to be significant because he gathered quite a following. And whatever it was that he did, he got the religious leaders really mad, and he got the Romans really riled up. And so he seems to be a significant historical figure. Well, let's go on to a guy named Tacitus. And you've probably heard me talk about Tacitus in church sometimes because he's one of the predominant historians of Rome. And he lived a little bit after Jesus, so he did most of his writing in the 2nd century, but the early 2nd century. So he's within 100 years of Jesus. And in Tacitus's writing, he's actually writing about Nero and the Great Fire of Rome, because most people believe that Nero was at fault for the fire, but he tried to blame the Christians. And so Tacitus is explaining how it was that Nero tried to shift blame from himself onto the Christians, and this is what he writes. "Consequently, to get rid of the report that Nero was guilty, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace." So notice, this is important, that in the 2nd century, the people of Rome hated Christians. But notice also, there were Christians in Rome by the 2nd century. So that's actually meaningful. Christus, he's talking about Jesus here, Christus, for whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius. So this is Tacitus writing, and essentially he says there's this guy, Jesus, who they call Christ, which is Messiah, and he suffered the extreme torture, which is crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius. So what is Tacitus saying? He's saying that Jesus is an actual historical figure who lived and died, and he died by crucifixion. And he goes on, he says, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So he's pretty much nailing down what the Gospels tell us. "And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular." So he finishes by saying there's this superstition among his followers, and by that he means the resurrection. That his followers believe in the resurrection, and it started in Judea, but by the time of Tacitus, this idea of resurrection had spread all the way to Rome. Let's look at another historian. This is Pliny the Younger. Interesting guy, actually was sent by the Emperor Trajan to investigate corruption in northern Turkey, an area called Bithynia. This would have been somewhat close to the churches of the Galatian region, and so Paul's writing to the Galatians would have been very close to Bithynia. And so here Trajan sends Pliny the Younger. You're wondering, why is he Pliny the Younger? Well, his dad was Pliny the Elder. I mean, that's just how they did it. So Pliny I and Pliny Jr. And Pliny Jr. gets sent to investigate corruption, government corruption. And while he's there, he comes upon these Christians again. And the Christians are causing a little bit of problem. Let me read to you a little bit about what the problem is. Christianity is spreading throughout the region. and the traditional temples are empty. So as people are getting saved and believing in Jesus, the traditional temples of the Roman gods are emptying out. And these temples were a great source of tax revenue. And so because Christianity is spreading, taxation is down, receipts are down. And so now some of the local people are pressuring Pliny, who's a representative of Rome, to do something about these Christians because they're hurting the economy. So this is what he does. He writes to the emperor, he writes to Trajan to get advice. And this is what he writes about the Christians. So he doesn't know a lot about Jesus. All he has to go on is what he hears from the Christians as he's trying to figure out who they are and what they're all about. This is less than 100 years after Jesus. And he writes this: they, the Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God. And so very early on, right, within 100 years of Jesus' life and death, the Christians believed that Jesus was God. Now, why would they believe that Jesus was God? Well, maybe because he did something that only God could do, right? They sang to him Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their words, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver. It seems like a pretty good group of people, right? They were committed to living good lives. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. So they were celebrating communion. So Pliny the Younger says, hey, there's this group of people, and they celebrate this guy named Jesus, who they think is a god. What should we do about them? And interestingly, Trajan, the emperor, says, don't worry about it. Just let them be. Very shortly after Trajan's reign, the following emperors began to persecute the Christians, and based partly on what Pliny said, began to prosecute them and ultimately kill them. Another man, Josephus, he's a pretty commonly known historian. He's actually a Jewish historian, lived shortly after the time of Jesus. Most of his writing is about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, but he also wrote about Jesus. I'm not going to go into great detail as to his writing because some people actually dispute it. And some people have suggested that maybe Josephus didn't actually write everything he's credited with writing. And so because of that, I'm just going to say we don't need Josephus's writing. We've got the writing of Tacitus. We've got the writing of Julius Africanus. We've got the writing of Pliny the Younger. And all of them point to the same truth, that Jesus was an actual historical person who lived and then died. All right, but let me show you three more. Three more. The first is the Jewish Talmud. So the Jewish Talmud is a collection of writings from lots of different sources, very similar to our Bible. Most of it is post-Babylonian exile writings, okay? And so these are writings that just tell about different things about the Jewish life, about their law, but also have some history mixed in. And there's a few different places where some of the Jewish Talmudic passages talk about Jesus. And let me show you two of them, okay? One of them says this. This is from the Babylonian Talmud. It says, on the eve of Passover, Yeshua, that's Jesus, was hanged. So he was hanged on a cross. That was how they hanged back then. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald cried, he is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Now, this is important because what they're saying is the reason Jesus was hanged, the reason Jesus was executed was twofold. One, he practiced sorcery. We'll see more about that in just a second. But number two, because he enticed Israel to apostasy. And here again, it's going back to Jesus claims himself to be God. And the reason they killed him was because he claimed to be God. And in their opinion, that was blasphemy because they didn't think he was. And so even though this passage doesn't look at Jesus very fondly, right? They think Jesus was a bad guy. What it does do is it does confirm what the Gospels tell us, that the reason Jesus was killed was because he claimed to be God. And that there were accusations against Jesus that the miracles he did were actually sorcery. Remember, the Pharisees said that about him. You're doing this by the power of Satan. So that kind of stuck. One more from the Talmud, it just says this: Jesus practiced magic and led Israel astray. So same basic principle, right? One more quote. Nope, two more quotes. I got two more. The first is from a guy named Lucian, and again, he's less than 100 years after Jesus, and he's kind of an author, kind of a comedic author, a satirist, and so he doesn't always say things straightforwardly, and he's certainly not a believer in Jesus. In fact, he's antagonistic to Jesus. But listen to what he says about Christians, and there's some telling things in here. He says the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. See, he thinks that's a bad thing. He thinks Jesus being crucified, that's a bad thing because it shows that he was a criminal, that he was a bad person. You see, these misguided creatures start with a general conviction that they are immortal for all time. That's exactly right. That's exactly what they believe. They believe that Jesus, who was crucified, gave them eternal life. And we could go on, but essentially you see the point here is here you have someone who certainly doesn't believe in Jesus, but acknowledges and admits that Jesus did live and he did die and he did have followers, and they believe that he gave them eternal life. One more. This is a guy named Celsus. He's a little further away from Jesus, probably around 175 AD, so maybe 150 years after Jesus. He's also an unbeliever. In fact, he doesn't like Christians. He doesn't like Jesus. But pay attention here and look for the common ground, because the common ground is that Jesus lived and Jesus died. This is what he said. By the way, I'm just going to say this. This is outrageous. This is the equivalent of what you might call like a journalistic hit piece, where he goes out and he finds like the most savage story he can, and there's no truth in it. There's no reason to believe it, but he's throwing it out there as a way to say, hey, Jesus wasn't a very good guy. So this is what he says. Jesus had come from a village in Judea and was the son of a poor Jewess who gained her living by the work of her own hands. His mother had been turned out of doors by her husband, who was a carpenter by trade, on being convicted of adultery with a soldier named Perea. Being thus driven away by her husband and wandering about in disgrace, she gave birth to Jesus, a bastard. Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt, and while there, he acquired certain magical powers, which Egyptians pride themselves on possessing. And he returned home highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them gave himself out to be a guide. Now pay attention to what's important here. Pay attention to the common ground. We can argue with him later about some of the other stuff he says, but what's the thing we can all agree upon here? Check it out. Number one, we can agree that Jesus actually lived, right? He was an actual historical person from Judea, born of Mary. That we all agree on that. Even people who didn't like Jesus agree on that. Number two, Jesus did miracles. Right? Did you notice that? Even the Jewish Talmud said Jesus did magic. And here Celsus says Jesus did magic. He learned magic in Egypt, and he did that magic. So Jesus actually did some really amazing things. That's going to bring us to part 2 in just a second, where we talk about miracles and whether or not we can actually believe in miracles. But let me wrap up part 1 just real quickly for you. What I want you to see is that it is completely reasonable. In fact, it's unreasonable not to believe that Jesus was an actual historical figure. And much of what we know about him from the Gospels is what everybody else said about him. He was born in Judea. He was born to Mary. His father, Joseph, was a carpenter. That's all common knowledge. We can all agree on that. He was a great teacher. He had lots of followers. He even did miracles. All of these things seem to be common knowledge about Jesus among those who lived at the time of Jesus. And so this is our starting point. And from here, we'll dive into the actual resurrection. But for now, let's just sit here for a second that Jesus was an actual historical figure. He lived and he died. He was executed by Rome. And what happened next is the big question. And we'll come back to that in part 2. All right, so we've established that Jesus was an actual person. He actually lived and he actually died. He was killed by the Romans. And before we get into what happened next, which I believe was the resurrection, we're just going to take a couple of minutes here and talk about this idea of miracles, because the resurrection is a miracle. And if you don't believe in miracles, you're going to have a hard time believing in the resurrection. But if you're okay with miracles, then you can probably be okay with the resurrection. So let's talk about miracles. Now, it used to be a couple hundred years ago, everybody believed in miracles. And that was because most people couldn't really explain the world we lived in. And if you can't explain it, you just chalk it up to a miracle and say, well, we don't know how this happened, but it must be a miracle. And now today, in the modern age, we've learned so much. Science has come so far. History is better. Archaeology is better. Everything is better. We know so much more. And the more we know, the less we don't know. At least that's what we think. And the more we know, the less likely we are to attribute certain phenomena to miracles. And so for modern man, the idea of miracles has kind of been thrown out the window as well. Miracles don't really happen. But let me slow that down just for a second and just challenge you to think for a second if that's really true. Can we really explain everything? I mean, we understand how life works, but we still have no idea where life comes from. We understand that there's this thing we all feel at some point called love. Whether it's a love for a pet or love for food or love for family, whatever it might be. We all understand that there's this concept of love, but can we really explain it, or any emotion for that matter? Where does it come from? And, we can sometimes boil it down and say, well, a lot of them come back to fear. Most of your emotions go back to fear or lack of fear. But the reality is we still can't explain everything about emotions. Now, maybe I shouldn't say this and maybe I'll get in trouble for it, but for all of our advancements, it seems like sometimes we're going backwards on what we can and can't explain. I can't help but notice that at least pre-modern man knew the difference between a man and a woman. And we seem to be having a hard time with that now. So I sometimes do wonder if we've really advanced as far as we think we have. But let's get back to the real question. The real question is, are you willing to believe in something that you can't explain? So if you can't explain it, if you can't give reason for it, are you willing to believe in it? I was looking around on the internet, and I know that's a great place to find stuff, right? But on Quora, I actually looked at a question that someone had asked about whether or not life is a miracle. And I came across one response that I thought was kind of interesting. It was by someone named Sam Serra. And I don't know who Sam Serra is. I don't know what Sam Serra believes, but I thought his answer was interesting to the question of whether or not life is a miracle. So listen to this. It's pretty good. He writes, you might notice that when we attempt to theorize about the possible origin of the universe, we are always left with a basic metaphysical problem. Those people who assume that the universe is a kind of mechanism are left asking, where did this mechanism come from? And what initiated it, right? So if the universe is just in motion and everything works, how did it get started? Who put it in motion? Those who believe the universe is a kind of computer simulation are left with the question, well, who made those who made the simulation, right? So I don't know people who actually believe that, but maybe they're out there, right? If you believe that everything is just a big simulation, well, who's the programmer, right? And where'd the programmer come from and who made the programmer? And sincere monotheists, that's us, with who made God. When we attempt to explain the universe, all we really do is move the metaphysical problem of whodunit up a level. It seems we can never get at the source of things. The fact of the matter is that for any of this to happen, at some point and by some means, something intrinsically mysterious had to occur. That is to say, something had to come into being that is a mystery even to itself. Because it having knowledge even of itself would imply some kind of prior phenomena. Do you see what he's saying? He's saying, look, there has to be this uncaused cause. There has to be this unstarted start, right? Somewhere something had to be different. If we take a miracle to be a totally inexplicable event that escapes containment or definition of any kind, then existence is a miracle. Somewhere at the beginning, something had to happen that we can't explain. Something that was different than everything we understand. Something had to get everything started. One more thing he says, the source of anything that exists must necessarily be a total mystery even to itself, and that is the miracle. For anything at all to exist, there must at the root of it be a fundamental, I don't know, right? Which I would say, well, maybe, or maybe at the beginning there is an uncaused cause, right? Or maybe at the beginning there is some eternal personal being who is creative and active, but that's for a different conversation. But the point is this, The point is this: somewhere, somehow, there has to be something that we can't explain. And the question is, if you can't explain it, what do you do with it? And here's where I would suggest that when you can't explain something, you look for the most reasonable explanation, but at some point you're going to have to be willing to say, there's something about this that I don't know. Let me boil it down for you this way. There's two ways of looking at the universe, of looking at everything. The first is to say, this is all there is. There's nothing else. That only what we can see and observe, only what we can measure or record or repeat, that's all there is to it. And if we can't see it, if we can't observe it, if we can't record it, if we can't repeat it, then it doesn't exist. Now here's the thing about that point of view. What that means is that all of us, everything, is just the result of random, dumb luck, right? It's just a big chance accident. It's a mistake. It just happened, and there's no explanation for it because there's nothing outside of this that gives us purpose. There's nothing outside of us that makes us inherently valuable. Think about it this way. If this is all there is, if there's nothing else here, what is it that makes me more valuable than a rock? There's really nothing that makes me more valuable than a rock because I'm just a result of random set of processes that happened to me that are different than the random set of processes that led to that rock. There's nothing that makes me more inherently valuable than that rock because there's nothing outside that gives meaning or purpose. That's worldview number one. There's nothing else. Worldview number two says, there's something more. Don't know exactly what it is. Can't fully explain it. But there's got to be something else. And that's where we come back to. There's this uncaused cause that sits outside of this reality, but that set this reality in motion. There's something else out there, something going on that made all this happen, that generated it, because otherwise it just doesn't make sense that it could have happened. But here's the thing. That perspective helps us understand why we prefer a sunset to a garbage dump. Right? We love sunsets. Why? Because we didn't make them. We look at a sunset. That is incredible. That is amazing. It is so beautiful. It is so obvious that it is intentional. It was created. That's amazing. I can't explain it. I don't know who designed sunsets, but that's incredible. We look at a garbage dump and we're like, yeah, we did that. We did that. We made that mess, and it's really not all that attractive. But a sunset is so much better. This is why we prefer, right, to sit at an ocean on a beach instead of in a war zone. Because the ocean on the beach says to us, there's something else here. Something else had to create this. We couldn't have made this ourselves, right? Something else did this. Whereas we're in a war zone, we're like, man, we are messed up. Look, we're bombing out buildings. We're bombing vehicles. This is terrible. This is what we do when left to ourselves. You see, inherently, all of us believe there's something else out there. There's something more. And this is the thing. If there is something else out there, if there is something more, and whatever that something more would be, like I'm not making an argument yet for a Judeo-Christian God. I'm simply saying if there's something else out there, and if that something else is at all involved in our world, and it has to be because it set the world in motion, then we should expect from time to time to encounter some phenomena that are unexplainable. We should expect from time to time to say, well, we don't understand this and we can't explain it because we think there's something else going on here. Now, here's the thing. I believe, this is where I'll step back into my Christian worldview just for a second. I believe that there is something else out there, and that something else is God. He's the creator and the sustainer of the universe. He's made all of this, and he loves us and wants to have a relationship with us, and that's why Jesus came, so that he could have a relationship with us. And Jesus, his whole purpose was to draw us to God. I believe all of that. So what that means is I realize that not everybody is going to hear what I'm saying and agree with it, because not everybody is going to come to God. Not everybody is going to believe in Jesus. And so when we talk about the resurrection and when we talk about miracles, there's really three reasons why we do it. right? The first is, maybe we can convince someone. Maybe we can use logic and reason and talk about what's reasonable, what's understandable, and maybe someone can be convinced to at least give it a look and to try it. So we hope to convince some people to at least think about this, at least consider whether or not following Jesus or knowing Jesus is reasonable. The second reason we talk about it is because we want people to be convicted. We understand and we believe that God, the Holy Spirit, convicts the hearts of people. And when they hear the truth of the gospel, which is that Jesus died and was resurrected, that the Holy Spirit can convict their hearts and begin to change them from the inside out. And so we don't shy away from that truth, and we proclaim that truth in hopes that some will be convicted by the Holy Spirit. But thirdly, and maybe this is the most important reason, is we talk about this kind of stuff because we want to instill confidence in those who believe. I want you to understand that if you believe in Jesus, if you believe that Jesus lived and died for your sins and that he rose again on the third day, I want you to have confidence to know that that is a perfectly reasonable belief. And the reason I tell you that is because, number one, Jesus was a historical figure, that we covered that already. Number two, it's reasonable to believe in miracles. It's not unreasonable to think there's something else out there that set all this in motion, to say there's stuff that we can't explain. And as long as humans are on this earth, there will be things that we can't explain. And as long as we can't explain everything, we have to say there's the potential for miracles. And it's not unreasonable to believe in miracles. And finally, in part 3, and we'll get there in just a second, I'm going to show you that it's perfectly reasonable to believe the greatest miracle of all, and that is that Jesus rose from the dead on the third day. So we'll get there in just a second. That's the end of part 2. We'll be right back with part 3. All right, so we've established that Jesus was an actual historical figure. He actually lived, he actually died, he was crucified by the Romans. Everybody agrees on that. That's our starting point, that's common ground. We've also established that it's pretty reasonable to believe that miracles can happen, that there are some things in our universe that we simply can't explain, and we have to realize there's more to it than we really know. And if that's true, then miracles are possible. And it's not unreasonable to believe that unexplainable events might happen. And that brings us to the resurrection, because that's the most maybe unexplainable event of all time. So is it reasonable to believe in the miracle of the resurrection? Well, I want to start by suggesting that there's a question that we need to answer. And actually, the answer to the question is the resurrection. But let me ask you the question, all right? Let me frame it for you. So Jesus died probably somewhere between 30 and 35 AD. Jesus died. He had a following. People liked him, but he died. Today, nearly 2,000 years later, Jesus has over 1 billion followers. Now, not like a social media account followers, but people who say, I follow Jesus. Jesus has over 1 billion followers around the world. People who say, I follow Jesus. So the question is, how did we get from there to here? How did we get from this place where Jesus died to a third of the world believes in Jesus? A third of the world claims to follow Jesus. I mean, in fact, maybe a better question is, how is it that within 300 years of Jesus' death, there were potentially 30 million people who were following him? 30 million. This is unexplainable. This is one of those things that we say, there's no way to explain how this happened. In fact, there's probably only one other similar event in human history, and that would be the growth and spread of another religion, Islam, right? And so if we're going to do a comparison, we might look at the two and say, well, how is it that Islam grew so fast, so large? Now, Muhammad was several hundred years after Jesus, so it's actually a younger religion than Christianity, but certainly it's a religion that spread very fast and today has a similar global reach to that of Christianity. But how did that happen? Well, the reality is that the growth of Islam and the growth of Christianity couldn't be more different. You see, the growth of Islam largely in its early days came through conquest, as Muhammad and some of his followers and those who followed him really conquered much of the known world by force. They went to war and they converted people at the sword. And that was how the religion grew in its earliest days. Now, later on, it grew through trade and through missionaries in somewhat similar ways as Christianity. But in the early days, it was conquest. Now compare that to Christianity because it's a stark difference. You see, the followers of Muhammad grew the religion by conquering. The followers of Jesus grew the religion by dying. So how is it that in less than 300 years, a religion of people who say they believe in a man who died and who get killed for that belief, right? That was a big part of the story of Christianity in the first couple of centuries, is that if you believed in Jesus, there was a good chance you'd get killed. So how is it that a religion of people who say they believe in a dead guy and who get killed for believing in that grows to be 30 million within 300 years and today is over 1 billion? How does that happen? And I want to suggest the only way something like that happens is if something unexplainable happens, right? Something amazing had to happen in order for Christianity to grow the way it did and to continue growing the way it has. Let me make my point this way. Jesus was not unique, right? Jesus he was unique in a lot of ways. But as far as being a messianic figure in the first century in Palestine, that wasn't all that special. In fact, there were actually many people around the time of Jesus who gathered followings, who actually, some of them led rebellions against Rome and against Herod. There were a lot of them. And they gathered followings, people loved them, people followed them. And for the most part, they all ended the same way as Jesus. They were either killed or executed, some of them even on crosses. Let me show you this, all right? You got to see this because I want you to understand these are actual historical people. They lived around the same time as Jesus. They did many of the same things as Jesus, but you probably don't know most of their names. Start with a guy named Judas of Galilee. And I'm starting here because he's actually mentioned in the Bible. All right, so in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 5, this is after Jesus has died and resurrected. He's gone back to be with the Father, and the church in Jerusalem is starting to grow, but the religious leaders, the same ones who killed Jesus, they're trying to stop it. And so they bring Jesus' followers in and basically say, you guys got to stop talking about Jesus. They say, no, we're not going to stop talking about Jesus. And then this guy Gamaliel stands up and he says, hey, I've got something to say here. Listen to what he says. He says, men of Israel, take care what you are about to do with these men. For before these days, Judas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. Now, by the way, Josephus mentions Judas. He talks about him and his rebellion and how it ended. It didn't end well. Judas lost his head, literally. So about 400 joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. Remember that phrase. Judas and his followers and his movement, it came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean, we're going to talk about him a little bit more in a second, rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. So again, same idea. Built up a following, rebelled, was killed. His movement came to nothing. His followers were scattered. So in the present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone, for if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found opposing God. Now, I don't know that Gamaliel knew what he was saying here, but essentially he said, look, let these guys alone. We've seen this before. Rebellions rise, rebellions fall. It will all go away. Don't worry. History won't remember them. They'll get swept under the rug like Judas, who you've never heard of, right? And like Judas the Galilean, who maybe you've heard of, but probably not. So Judas the Galilean is kind of like the Braveheart of his day. He is rebelling against Roman taxes. And if any Jewish people didn't join his side, he burned their houses down because he was leading this big rebellion. He assembles an army. He goes to battle. He's killed. But his sons rise up several years later. They have their own rebellion. They fail also. They're crucified. Even one of his grandsons, a guy named Menahem, leads another rebellion. And this is the final rebellion that leads to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And you know what happens to him. He loses and he's killed. You don't know any of these people. Why don't you know any of these people? Because it didn't matter how big a following they had in the moment. When they died, their movement was over, right? Nobody wants to follow a dead revolutionary. And so when they died, their movement was over. It was forgotten, other than a few jots and tittles written in history books that they talked about. Here's another one, Simon of Perea. Simon of Perea, similar. He's a little before Jesus' time. He was actually a slave of Herod. All right, so he's a little before Jesus, but he's a slave of Herod. He leads a rebellion. He anoints himself king, and then he's beheaded. Now, some have suggested that he referred to himself as the Messiah occasionally. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But here's the point. You've not heard of him either. And in fact, most people haven't heard of Simon of Perea either. He led a rebellion. He gathered a following. He was anti-Rome, anti-Herod, but he was killed, and his movement was over. There's a guy mentioned, we don't know his name, he's just called the Egyptian, and Josephus writes about him. Interestingly, 30,000 men joined his movement, gathered with him on the Mount of Olives to invade Jerusalem, to liberate Jerusalem from the Romans. Did you hear that number? 30,000. That's a big group of followers. What happened? They lost, he disappeared, and he disappeared from history, right? Because when the movement fails, the followers scatter. And that's really the end of it. One more. This guy came about 100 years after Jesus. His name is Simon Bar Kokhba. And he was actually one of the most successful revolutionaries of Palestine. He actually set up a Jewish state. It was a small area, but it was after the fall of Jerusalem. He set up a Jewish state, and he actually ruled for 3 years, and he called himself the Star. He called himself the Messiah, and many people believed him, and many people followed him. But eventually the Romans came in. Do you know what the Romans did to him? They killed him. And once they killed him, what happened to his movement? It was over. You see, this is a simple truth of history. All of these people have the same thing in common. They raised up followers. They had a great movement. Many of them were considered to be the Messiah, just like Jesus was. They were killed or executed, and then they were forgotten. And that brings us back to our question, right? We all agree that Jesus lived and died. He was executed. And we actually all agree that he led a big movement. He had lots of followers. In fact, most historians say he did some kind of magic deeds, right? We call them miracles. Some call them magic. So he did all of these things. But like all these other revolutionaries, he died. So what made him different? What made his followers different? Why did his followers start a movement? I mean, I have to ask the question, why did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John write Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? If Jesus was dead, there doesn't seem to be much of a point in writing his story out from beginning to end, especially not like John, maybe 50 or 60 years after Jesus' death. Why did he write it out if Jesus just lived and died and that was the end of the movement? But that wasn't the end of the movement. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is it that made Jesus different than all of these others? And the answer is the resurrection. Or how about if we just say the claim of resurrection? Because Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, they all make that claim. Jesus rose from the dead. So how do you prove or disprove a resurrection? Right? Think about that. How can you disprove a resurrection? Well, the only way to prove a resurrection is what? For the person to show themselves. Like if someone's risen from the dead, if I come to you and I say Elvis is alive, Elvis has risen from the dead, what needs to happen for you to believe me? You need to see Elvis, right? Well, if I see Elvis, then I'll believe that. I mean, maybe I'll believe. I don't know. Maybe it's an impersonator. So if you're going to prove that Jesus raised from the dead, Jesus has to show himself. Now, the Gospels, they tell us that Jesus did show himself. And remember, Tacitus also said, hey, there was a story, right, that he didn't like this story. He called it a superstition, but he at least acknowledges there are people out there who believe that Jesus rose from the dead. But how do you disprove a resurrection? Actually, disproving a resurrection is much easier than proving it. What do you have to do? You have to show the body. That's it. If you can simply show the body, you've proven that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. So in the earliest days of Christianity, when guys like Matthew and John and Mark, when they were hiding out in Jerusalem after Jesus' death, then all of a sudden the rumors started. People start talking about this guy's been resurrected. And, less than a year after Jesus' alleged resurrection, Peter gets up at the Feast of Pentecost and makes this big speech about Jesus who has resurrected. All that needed to happen at that moment to shut the movement down was for someone to produce the body of Jesus. That's all that had to happen. If at any moment after Jesus' crucifixion, the body of Jesus had been produced and someone had said, look, here he is dead, he is not alive, the movement dies, it's over. Because the entire movement is based on this one fact that Jesus has risen from the dead. So why didn't the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the scribes or the elders, the Sanhedrin as a whole, why didn't they produce the body? They desperately wanted to shut the movement down. They desperately wanted to keep Christianity from spreading. Why didn't they produce the body? Why didn't Pontius Pilate produce the body? Right? Why didn't he say, wait a minute, I authorized this guy's execution. Here's the body. Let's stop the rumors. Let's get back to life as normal. The last thing Pontius Pilate wanted was some big movement to start in Palestine that would ultimately affect Rome. That's exactly what happened. Why didn't Pontius Pilate produce the body? Well, we can't say for sure, can we? But what we can say for sure is that the body was never produced. So here's our facts. These are the facts of the case. And as they say in A Few Good Men, these are the facts of the case, and they are not in dispute. Jesus was a real historical figure. Everybody agrees on that. He lived and he died. He was executed by Rome. Everybody agrees on that. There's an empty tomb. Everybody agrees on that. So what do we do with it? Well, I want to approach the fact of the empty tomb from the perspective of a murder mystery. I've talked before about how my wife and I like to watch British murder mysteries, and one of our favorites is called Death in Paradise. And in Death in Paradise, you got this little crew of detectives, and whenever there's a murder, they sit down and they put up their board, and they put the dead person in the middle of the board, and then all around the side of the board, they put all of the suspects, right? They line up all the suspects, and then they look for three things. They look for, you know what these are, right? Means, motive, and opportunity. Because if they can find someone who had means, motive, and opportunity, it's likely that that's the killer. But if someone doesn't have means, or doesn't have motive, or doesn't have opportunity, it's most likely that they're not the killer. So let's just talk about the case of the missing body and look at the suspects and determine who was it that had means, who was it that had motive, and who was it that had opportunity? So who are the suspects? Well, I think the suspects can be obviously the followers of Jesus, right? That was the rumor that they stole the body. The suspects could also be the religious leaders. They were Jesus' greatest enemies. Perhaps they stole the body. Maybe the soldiers who are on guard. Now, we often think they're Roman soldiers, and it's very possible that they were, but it's also possible that they were temple guards who would have been not Roman soldiers, but would have been highly trained soldiers with all the weapons they needed to guard the tomb. So whether they were Roman soldiers or temple guards, we can say maybe they're a suspect. Pontius Pilate, the Roman authorities, maybe he's a suspect. Herod, maybe he's a suspect, right? Or what about just a simple grave robber, a nameless grave robber who just robbed graves? Maybe that's who took the body. We don't know. Well, let's look at each suspect and evaluate whether or not they had means, motive, and opportunity. Let's start with the soldiers. Now, some might say, David, we don't even know for sure that there were soldiers, right? Matthew tells us about the soldiers, but the other Gospels don't really mention them. And someone who doesn't believe the Bible might say, how do I even know that there were soldiers? To which I would say, okay, fine. Let's say there weren't soldiers. Then we know that the soldiers didn't steal the body, so we can rule them out as suspects. But if you believe there were soldiers, let's ask the questions. Did they have means? Did they have motive? Did they have opportunity? Well, of course, they had means. They were guarding the tomb, right? They had the ability to steal the body. That's an obvious one. Did they have opportunity? Of course they had opportunity. They were there. They have no alibi. Obviously, they were there all together. They could have stolen the body. But did they have motive? Probably not. In fact, really, they didn't have motive, because to steal the body would have been to fail at their job. If they were Roman soldiers, it would have been the death penalty. If they were the temple guard, it could have also meant the death penalty. I mean, the temple guard was working for some pretty ruthless people. The Sanhedrin, they were bad dudes. They had just killed Jesus. And so there's no reason they wouldn't have killed the temple guard if the temple guard lost the body. So they really didn't have motive. In fact, they had motive to keep the body where it was. So let's rule them out as suspects. And let's maybe talk just for a second about the religious leaders, right? Or maybe the religious leaders and Pilate and Herod, because all of them together kind of the leadership in Jerusalem. Now, did they have the means to steal the body? Of course they did. They could do whatever they want. They had all the power. Did they have the opportunity? Sure, they could have gone to the garden. Now, the guards would have known, the temple guards or the Roman soldiers would have known, but they could have gone to the garden. They could have stolen the body. They had the opportunity. But again, did they have the motive? Well, their only motive for taking the body would have been to display the body. And the fact that they didn't display the body probably means they didn't have the body, right? Why would they steal the body and hide the body and give birth to the rumor of resurrection? That would be counterproductive. It would go against everything they were trying to accomplish. And so their motive was to keep the body so they could show the body. They were again motivated to keep the body in the tomb. So we can rule them out as suspects. They probably didn't steal the body. What about a grave robber? Well, I suppose it's possible. Would a grave robber have motive? Sure, I guess. If you're a grave robber, that's what you do. You rob graves. Would they have had means? Probably. I mean, if you're a grave robber, you probably know how to rob a grave. They've had opportunity. That really depends on the view you take of the soldiers, right? If it was Roman soldiers, no, they didn't have opportunity. If it was temple guards, yeah, they probably didn't have an opportunity. If there were no guards or soldiers, maybe they had an opportunity. But that motive thing, even though they would have had the opportunity to steal the body, let's just say a grave robber robbed Jesus' grave. What would you do with the body if you were a grave robber? What would have been most profitable? Well, the most profitable thing to do with the body would have been to do what? To take it to the religious leaders. They were desperate to have the body. They would have paid a lot of money to get the body of Jesus. Pilate would have done the same thing. And if the people in power wanted the body and a grave robber had the body, you would think that they would figure out how to get the body from the grave robber. Whether by force or by paying for it, they would have gotten the body. So I think we can rule out the idea that it was a grave robber. That just really only leaves us with the disciples. Now, did they have motive? Sure, right? If their goal was to start a world religion, which maybe is a little odd anyways, but if their goal was to start a world religion based on the idea of resurrection, then sure, steal the body, that's a great way to do it. But did they have means? Not really. I mean, you remember these guys, they were fishermen. They were tax collectors. They weren't soldiers. They weren't grave robbers. They wouldn't have really known how to do it. Did they have opportunity? No, for sure not. Again, soldiers, that's a problem. But also, they were in mourning. Right? They thought Jesus was dead. They were in hiding. They thought their lives were in danger. They certainly didn't have opportunity. But beyond all of that, I think the rest of their lives really demonstrates to us that the disciples didn't steal the body. We talk about this a lot. That here you have, let's just say, 11 men. 11 men who eventually all, except for John, died for their belief that Jesus was alive. 11 men whose lives were absolutely changed. Peter and John, they didn't go back to fishing. They became missionaries. They traveled around the world. So people who had spent their whole life in one little fishing town traveled around the world telling people about Jesus. Now, if they had stolen the body, why would they do that? If they had stolen the body, why would they not kind of admit to that to save their own lives? And so there is a question that we have to ask about whether or not the disciples really would have stolen the body. Beyond that, here's where I think the words of Paul help us a little bit. Now, I said we're going to stay away from this for the most part, but I want to show you something that Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 15:6, okay? So this is Paul. By the way, most people agree, most historians agree that Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians and that he specifically wrote them to the church in Corinth. There's not a lot of dispute about that. And so Paul is writing this letter to the church in Corinth. Listen to what he says. He's talking about the resurrection of Jesus. He says, "Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time." Now, if you're just trying to start a religion, that's a great claim to make, isn't it? To say, he didn't just appear to the apostles, he appeared to 500 people at once. But listen to what he says next. "Most of whom are still alive." This is Paul challenging the reader. He's saying, look, you don't have to believe me. Jesus appeared to over 500 people. You have to believe them. Now listen. Think this through. If the disciples stole the body, would there be 500 people who would acknowledge that they saw Jesus alive? How does that happen? You can't have 500 people in on the plot, right? 500 people all work together to steal the body, and none of them ever cracked. They all were willing to die for that belief. That's not reasonable. That's not reasonable at all. If you have 500 people who say they saw someone at the same time, so this is not 500 people at different times. Paul says 500 people at the same time. This is not a mass delusion. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is 500 people who years later are willing to say, yes, I was there on that day in that place and I saw Jesus. That's a powerful testimony. And it seems to indicate that the disciples probably didn't steal the body. In fact, the disciples probably believed that Jesus was alive. So how do we wrap all this up? Well, I think what we can say for sure is we have three facts, right? The facts are Jesus lived, Jesus died, and there's an empty tomb. And now what we have to do is say, what is the most reasonable explanation for this? Right? We can't really prove this either way. It's 2,000 years later. No one's going to produce the body of Jesus, so the resurrection can't be disproved. Jesus in his resurrected body is not around anymore, so he's not going to appear to us as the resurrected Christ, so it can't be proved in that way. So we simply have to say, what is the most reasonable explanation for the facts that we have? What is the most reasonable explanation for the missing body, for the empty tomb? And I want to suggest to you that the most reasonable explanation for the empty tomb is that Jesus is alive. There's really not anybody who benefited by stealing the body. In fact, if you look at means, motive, and opportunity, there really isn't a likely suspect. In fact, there isn't a suspect. There's no one that could have or would have stolen the body. And so we can't go with the body was stolen, and yet history confirms that the body was missing 3 days after the crucifixion. There's no evidence to the contrary of a resurrection. I mean, that's something to think about, right? There is no evidence to the contrary of the resurrection. There's lots of evidence for it, lots of eyewitness testimony, lots of historical testimony. There's this little movement called Christianity where 30 million people believed in Jesus less than 300 years after his death and over 1 billion people today. That's really unexplainable unless something amazing happened. You have 11 men and several other close followers who are willing to give their lives for the truth that Jesus was resurrected. I want to suggest to you that the resurrection is the most reasonable explanation for the growth of Christianity. The resurrection is the most reasonable explanation for the empty tomb, and it's the most reasonable explanation for the behavior of the disciples. They were empowered, they were encouraged, they were emboldened by something. Maybe it was the fact that they saw their best friend alive after they saw their best friend crucified. Now finally this. I really didn't discuss the Gospels at all, or Acts, or any of the other scriptures. But I need to say this. The Gospels themselves are written by actual real people, right? Matthew actually saw Jesus die, and he saw Jesus resurrected. That's why he said he saw the resurrected Jesus. Mark, who wrote the book of Mark, and probably wrote from the words of Peter, but I think also probably knew Jesus and saw Jesus. Mark believed that Jesus was alive. That's why he wrote what he wrote. Luke never met Jesus. He came later in the story. But Luke was a historian, and he says in the book of Luke, I interviewed lots of people to try to get to the bottom of this. And then after interviewing as many eyewitnesses as he could, Luke came to the conclusion, Jesus is alive. John, he walked with Jesus. He talked with Jesus. He was the disciple who Jesus loved. And if you read the book of John, it's very clear that he was an eyewitness account of all of this. And John said, I believe that Jesus is alive. James, who was the brother of Jesus, he wrote later on that Jesus was Lord. Now, what's interesting about this is James didn't believe in Jesus. James initially, he didn't think Jesus was the Messiah. In fact, there was a moment when James, one of Jesus' brothers, and Mary and some of the other brothers came to Jesus and said, hey, dude, you're out of your mind. Come home with us. Let's get you better. And Jesus said, no, I'm doing what the Father sent me to do. But later on, James changed his mind about Jesus. James no longer believed that Jesus was out of his mind, but he said, Jesus is Lord of my life. Now, what does it take for someone to make that move? Well, something amazing has to happen. Something unexplainable has to happen. And finally, there's Paul. Paul, who wrote about the 500 witnesses, who wrote about himself seeing the Jesus who was raised from the dead. And by the way, Paul, who studied under Gamaliel. Remember Gamaliel, the one who said, leave these guys alone. If it's of God, it will work out. And if it's not, it won't. Paul studied under him, but later came to the conclusion, after talking to men like Peter and John and James, after maybe encountering Jesus for himself, Paul determined that Jesus is indeed resurrected. These are all eyewitness accounts. Now, some people don't think they're reliable, and some people do. And it's up to you to determine whether or not they are. But at the end of the day, the most important question to ask is, what does the resurrection mean to you? What does the resurrection mean for you? You see, if there's even the slightest chance, just the smallest, tiniest possibility that God actually became man and came to earth to teach us, to show us how to live, and to show us the way to have eternal life, if there's even the slightest possibility of that, and if there's even the slightest chance that that man proved to us that he was God by raising from the dead, if there's even just the slightest little chance that that is possible, that could be reasonable, then don't you owe it to yourself? Don't you to at least check it out? To at least say, I need to know exactly what this Jesus guy was all about. If there's just the slightest chance that he was God, and there's just the slightest chance that he rose from the dead, and I think I've shown you today that it's more than reasonable to say, yeah, this is more than likely, it's higher than probable that Jesus rose from the dead. You see, if God really did come to earth in the form of Jesus, and God really did come to earth to show us how to live and why to live his way, and if he came to earth to demonstrate his love to us by dying for us and then resurrecting for us, then the most important decision we can ever make is to choose to follow him, to choose to follow the resurrected Christ.